Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago UN campus in Hong Kong. Welcome to this evening's Directors Picked series. We're sharing today's event live via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube from the U Chicago UN campus in Hong Kong. If audience members have questions to submit, you can do so through the question and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I also encourage you to visit the UChicago UN campus website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to the e-news for the latest programs and information. We'll wrap up tonight's program with a poll, so please be sure to stay tuned until the very end. Tonight we'll discuss a very timely and important topic, Fukushima Wastewater, policy, health risks, PR, and ethics. Tonight, we'll seek to understand the truth regarding the Fukushima wastewater controversy and explore the policy implications for international cooperation and longer-term governance of nuclear energy and the potential health risks to humans and whether the PR and public outcry are actually justified. Let's start tonight with a brief introduction of our speaker. Robert Rosner is the William E. Rather Distinguished Service Professor in the Departments of Astronomy and Astrophysics and Physics, as well as in the Enrico Fermi Institute and the Harris School of Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago. He was the founding co-director of the Energy Policy Institute, EPIC, at U Chicago. And he served as Argonne National Laboratory's chief scientist and was the founding chair of the U.S. Department of Energy's National Laboratory Directors Council. Within the past few years, Professor Rosner has been increasingly involved in energy technologies and public policy issues that relate to the development and deployment of various energy production and consumption technologies, including, especially, nuclear energy, the electrification of transport, and energy usage in urban environments. Thank you for joining us tonight, Professor Rosner. This is an extremely important topic for us here in Asia, and you're the right expert for us to learn more about some of the hazards and hopefully help us just understand what the truth is behind this topic. So I'll hand the program over to you so that you can deliver your presentation and help us better understand this really important topic.
Well, it's a pleasure to be able to virtually be in Hong Kong and to talk about this topic. So let's go to the first slide, content slide. So first, just to introduce myself a little bit more, the audience might wonder, what my expertise is to talk about this topic. And so I just wanted to say that I've dealt with things nuclear for a great number of years. I was chief scientist and director of Argonne National Laboratory, which was the first American nuclear nuclear energy laboratory. I have dealt with the design of nuclear power plants, and also I've been involved in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, of course, the nonprofit that resulted from Chicago physicists deciding maybe we should worry about the uses of energy. So what I'll talk about is first about the science of the contaminated wastewater from Fukushima Daiichi, the physics, the biology, and then I'll touch on some of the political aspects of the policy, the public relations issues, and some of the ethical issues. So can we go to the next slide? So what is this wastewater? So the key thing to understand, this is not ordinary reactor cooling water, the kind of stuff that comes out of reactors that are sitting next to oceans worldwide. This water is the result of having to cool down the 3 damaged reactor cores. And what that means is that this water contains radioactive elements that are not present in cooling water that comes from existing reactors that are functioning. There's a lot of this water has been stored It's sitting in over 1,000 tanks on site. 3.5 times 10 to the eighth gallons. It's an enormous amount of water that's being stored. The picture that was in the background of my title slide was an aerial view of the tank farm that's sitting at Fukushima Daiichi. It's really quite amazing how much water has been stored there. It contains 64 radionuclides in addition to the tritium. So in fact, there are 65, total of 65 radionuclides. And some of them are familiar to those of you who know something about how reactors work. They include carbon-14, cobalt-67, cesium-137, iodine-129, strontium-90, and of course the tritium. The key thing to understand is that the most radioactive elements are cesium and strontium. And as I'll show in a moment, those are removed in a separate process, filtration process, from the process that removes everything else except for the tritium. The key thing about the tritium is that it's an isotope of hydrogen, and so chemically, it's identical to ordinary hydrogen. And this is why you can't remove it chemically. And the only thing you can do is basically to dilute it. And I'll talk about that in a moment as well. Now, the Japanese firm that operated Fukushima, TEPCO, is also in charge now of dealing with this wastewater. And it has built a filtration and dilution system before this material is put into the Pacific Ocean. We can go to the next slide. So here's a picture of this filtration system. And so there are a number of steps that are taken in order to remove virtually all of the radioactive materials. And the system contains a number of elements, which you'll see in the next slide. Okay, so this is a schematic of what actually happens. So the water stream has two origins. One is simply rain, groundwater, as well as water that is specifically used to cool the damaged reactor cores. It turns out that the most radioactive materials that are sitting in that water are cesium and strontium. And the Japanese have put in place a process, a dual process, to try to remove as much of that as possible before you ever get to the filtration system that many of you might have heard about, the ALPS system, which is this advanced liquid processing system. So what happens is that first the cesium and strontium is removed. That the resulting water is then put in storage tanks, which are labeled here, the strontium treated water storage tanks. And from there, the water then is put through this ALPS system that removes as much as possible the remaining nuclear material, except for, as I said before, except for the tritium, which cannot be filtered out. And that water is then put into these treated water tanks, which are separate from the strontium treated water tanks. Okay, and the idea is that the water that's released into the Pacific comes from these treated water tanks that are at the end of this schematic of this chain of filtration systems. Could we go to the next slide? So the obvious question is this released water safe? So if, and this is a big if the filtration and dilution system works properly, the answer is yes. What does that mean? That means that the tritium is the only remaining significant radionuclide. All the others would have been filtered out to the point where the water that's coming out of the filtration system contains these other isotopes well below regulatory limits. So from the point of, and the limits are established by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is an independent agency that has representation from essentially all nations that have nuclear power. It's part of the UN system, and has representations from, for example, the neighboring states of Japan, so China and South Korea, etc. Now, the dilution system has to be there because you can't remove the tritium from the water. And so the idea is to mix the wastewater with other water that's free of tritium. And the idea is to mix it sufficiently so that the water that eventually emerges, that's sitting in these treated tanks, has a tritium level that's well below the safety limits established by, for example, by the World Health Organization, the WHO. So here's a little bit of technical nomenclature. A becquerel, abbreviated BQ, is simply a measure of radioactivity, and what it means is one becquerel is one radioactive decay per second, and so one becquerel per liter means that that the water has one radioactive decay per second per that liter. Okay, so the WHO limit is 10,000 becquerel per liter. The TEPCO target, what they're working toward, is 1,500 becquerel per liter at the source, meaning at the point where they're putting the water into the Pacific. And the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Agency, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency, have both conducted actual measurements, in fact, of the release that happened on August 24 of this year. And there were 10 samples taken within 10 kilometers of the discharge point, and all 10 samples showed a radioactivity level that was less than 10 becquerel per liter. In other words, the Japanese beat their target by a factor of 100. It's really, so at this point, one would say the system is really working actually better than expected. The other thing to keep in mind is that there is an aspect here that's often ignored, which is the current system in the ocean. So if you can go to the next slide, I will show you that. So on the left is the way the sampling is done. So around Fukushima, there's a 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer square area, target area, where the monitoring is done. That's where the samples are taken to see what is actually in the water that's being released into the Pacific. On the right-hand side is a picture that's been generated by oceanographers for what the current system in the Pacific looks like. And if you notice that there is a current, it's called the Kuroshi current, that goes northward along the eastern coast of Japan. So it goes past Fukushima Daiichi, and when it goes past it, it then heads east directly to the North American continent. In other words, the water that's being released from Fukushima Daiichi is not heading toward Asia. It's heading actually toward North America, toward us. So if you're worried about whether or not this contaminated water is heading toward you, and you're sitting in China, for example, or South Korea, if you look at that picture, you notice that that's not where the water is going. Okay. Can we go to the next slide? So the obvious question is, the Japanese have made many contentions, and the obvious question is, should we trust them? That's a key key question. So the key player in establishing trust is the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, which is a UN body, and it has three major components in its analysis. First of all, an overall assessment of the system, and then it has looked at the details of the regulatory activities and the processes, the actual physical processes that are going on. And then it has conducted independent sampling, independent data analysis of the samples. And the idea is, do they replicate the results that are reported by the Japanese? And to date, the answer is they have been able to replicate what the Japanese have done. So they're actually two independent samplers of what the company TEPCO is doing. One is the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Agency, the NRA, which maybe as an aside, I should just mention, was created after Fukushima Daiichi disaster happened. And it was created precisely because the original regulatory body in Japan basically didn't really have much supervisory or enforcement powers. And the Japanese themselves realized that it was not going to be sensible. And so they created an independent agency that's separate from the Atomic Energy Agency that is a promoter of nuclear energy in Japan, separate from the company TEPCO that is operating the facility. And this NRA has done its own sampling in addition to what TEPCO does, and the IAEA has also done its independent sampling. And so far, they all seem to agree. So that's a key point, that at this point, what we can say is that the levels of radioactivity in the wastewater that actually enters into the Pacific at Fukushima Daiichi is in fact far below international safety levels. Okay, and everybody who's on this program has access to the actual IEA report. You can go to the web and look for it, and it is available. So you can look at it for yourself just to make sure that what I'm saying is correct. Could we go to the next slide? So the obvious question is, if everything I said is true, why are people so upset? And I think there are two answers to that. One of them, probably the most important, has to do with the fact that everything that I've said so far that seems to be saying it's all okay is predicated on the idea that TEPCO actually does everything correctly and continues doing it correctly, that the Nuclear Regulatory Agency in Japan continues doing the monitoring, and that it is able to force TEPCO to fix problems if there are problems that are identified. So having said that, it's very important to understand that there are lots of folks that really doubt whether or not Japan will actually continue to perform safely. And sad to say, Japan doesn't have an outstanding history in this regard. Fukushima Daiichi itself is the perfect illustration of what the problem has been in Japan. The second issue, of course, is a political issue, which is that there are historical animosities between Japan and a number of its neighbors. And finally, and it's a point I'm going to return to, not everybody's convinced that the IEA independent analyses can be trusted. So having said that, there's another issue, and that has to do with the fact that what we do know is that when fish or other sea animals ingest tritium-loaded water, that the biological processes can actually lead to an increase in the concentration of tritium inside the bodies of these animals. And there's a lot to be said about this. I can come back to that perhaps during the question period. But it turns out that at the measured tritium concentrations that we know about now, and with the fact that there's continued dilution in the Pacific currents as the current sweeps past Japan and heads east toward North America, the wastewater concentrations are going to be even further diluted from the numbers that you saw earlier. And in fact, at that point, the tritium level in this waste stream as it goes eastward is actually comparable to the natural background of tritium. You have to keep in mind that tritium is a radioactive element that nature itself produces, and therefore, even if we didn't have any nuclear power plants, there would be tritium in the seawater. And it turns out the wastewater eventually reaches levels of concentration of tritium that's comparable to the natural level. So I'm going to return to this issue of biologically contaminated issues in a moment. Could we go to the next slide, please? So here's my advice. The first point is that all of Japan's neighbors are members of the IEA, and therefore are in the position to insist that the international agency continues its oversight. And I think that is extremely important. I think independent data sampling, independent data corroboration analysis are essential, absolutely essential to making sure that you can actually trust the process that's going on. And it seems to me that that is a position that the Japanese themselves should also be supported. The second is that I noticed that some of the questions that have been posed as part of this program get at a fundamental fact, which is that the tritium is really not the problem. The real problem are the other radioisotopes that are sitting in the original wastewater. Remember that tritium is fundamentally never really much of a biological hazard, because if you ingest tritium, it turns out within 10 days, it's going to be gone. So this is an issue that's been studied for a number of years. The question is, if you ingest a particular tagged hydrogen atom, how long does it on average stay in your body? And the answer is virtually all of the tagged hydrogen actually is flushed out. It's not absorbed in your body. Even if it is incorporated biologically, so it binds to a carbon atom inside your body, and so you might think, well, it's going to stay in there for its full lifetime. The half-life of tritium is a bit more than 12 years. The answer is even the biologically bound form of tritium is flushed out on the course of about a month. So that's a key point, because it means that the tritium never accumulates in your body. This is not true for some of the other isotopes. And one of them in particular, iodine-129, is particularly dangerous in this regard, because it is known that it accumulates in your body and can cause cancer. And it does cause cancer. This is one of the principal worries about contaminated water, which is if it contains elements such as strontium and iodine. And those can be in the wastewater if the filtering system fails. Is that a worry? Yes, it is, because the failure of the system that exists in Fukushima has already occurred. 2 years ago, there was a failure of the system, and there was an enormous amount and big uproar about it. It's interesting that you don't see this mentioned in the in the public media currently. But the fact of the matter is, the weak point in the filtration system, in the entire system that the Japanese have constructed, is this filtration system. Because if it fails, then radioisotopes that are far more dangerous, that are really dangerous, can get into the Pacific, and that is a problem. So, so my argument would be that the Japanese neighbor should focus not on the tritium, it should focus on additional safeguards put in place for the Fukushima Daiichi filtration system, and in particular focus on measures to deal with immediate stopping the dumping of the water if a failure occurs. And the only way that can be done is if there's constant ongoing monitoring of the output of the filtration system. It's extremely important. The third point is that has to do with dealing with the folks that don't trust the International Atomic Energy Agency. If you don't trust the international agency, the fact of the matter is that all the neighbors of Japan that have a nuclear industry, that includes China, includes Korea, are perfectly capable of doing their own monitoring. And it's not expensive, number one. Number two is any reasonable technological university has the capacity to both do the sampling and the analysis. And so this is not, this is not a mysterious art. This is something that physicists, radiochemists understand perfectly well how to do. And so if you don't trust the international agency, you can do it yourself. So with that, I think I've reached the end of my talk, and I think we can go on to the question and discussion period.
Very good. Thank you, Professor Rosner, for that great overview. That was just the right level of depth, actually, and tempo. And there have been so many questions that have been coming in. We had some pre-questions before the program. I guess what I'd like to do is start by talking about the treatment and the testing issue that you just finished addressing. And you mentioned that there was a failure of the filtration system 2 years ago. And just to be clear, that's the ALPS system that's often referred to.
The ALPS system, right.
The ALPS system, okay. Can you describe that failure and how the Fukushima authorities responsible for that system addressed it to give us confidence?
Yeah. So it turns out that some of the filtering material basically didn't function. And exactly what was wrong, I think, was not really publicly addressed. But it was clear that the filtration, the material that actually does the filtering, some of it was defective. And so at the time, they didn't really have a system in place to determine whether the filtration material that's inserted into the system at the time of insertion is in fact functioning. I don't know the answer to the question of exactly what the failure was. What I do know is that the material simply didn't successfully remove the 62 radionuclides that are supposed to be removed, and that's the only thing I really know about that.
Would the AIEA get involved in actually doing testing at the filtration system itself? Or, because you referred to earlier this 10 meter by 10 meters area within the water. I'd like to kind of dissect both of those pieces, if you don't mind.
Right. So the testing, there are two different kind of levels of tests are done. One is, if you remember the schematic diagram, after filtration system, the water goes in these holding tanks that hold the filtered water. And there's an ongoing program to measure the level of radionuclides in the filtered water. So that's step one. The step two is then go inside that 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer box that illustrated, and then to check what happens there. And the reason for doing that two-step process is that much of the dilution happens between the holding tanks and when the effluent comes out and goes in the Pacific. So what they're testing both is the filtration system functioning? That's the testing of the tanks. And then in the 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer area, is the dilution system working properly? So those are the two different tests that you have to do. And so, the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Agency does testing in both areas, and as well as the IAEA.
Very good. And on that 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer, are they doing testing at all different depths within the water? I don't know how deep that body of water is, but do these elements, do they sink? Are they at the surface typically?
No, no, they don't sink. So it turns out that water near seashores, so it has to. This is a key point actually. The top, if you look at an ocean, the top, roughly speaking, 100 feet, so 30 meters of seawater is extremely well mixed, and it's mixed by wave action, especially near shores. Once you get much further out, when you get out further into the ocean, then there's a separate mixing that happens to the deep ocean. That's very, very slow and gradual. So when you're testing within this 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer area, there isn't much difference of concentration, if any, as a function of depth. There is when you go further out. Okay, and so the dilution that happens that I referred to as you go out is actually horizontal dilution, not dilution in depth. It's really quite remarkable how well mixed the surface is, but how little mixed the full ocean is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We have one of our U Chicago faculty from Chicago, maybe elsewhere, maybe in Asia, asking a question here. Dr. Kim is asking the question, first of all, excellent presentation, very informative. And your suggestion about the neighbors doing independent data sampling and analysis, she thought that was a really good idea. But one issue that she's concerned about is the distrust between the public, at least, with some governments and their own governments and scientists. Do you have any comments about how we can kind of overcome the, mistrust between public, science, and governments?
You're asking, that is a great question, and I don't think anybody has a really good answer to that question. I think my own sense is that the more players there are that are involved in the testing, the better off we are, because having TEPCO, and remember that TEPCO itself does testing, like the company's doing testing. Mm-hmm. And so right now there are three players. There's TEPCO, and there are good reasons to be a bit skeptical about TEPCO. Then there's the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Agency, which is, in a sense, untested, right? I mean, it's only been in existence since Fukushima Daiichi, and you have to kind of keep your fingers crossed that they're not politically influenced, but they're testing. And then you have the IAEA. And to date, those three players all get the same result. So that's kind of reassuring. If you don't trust the international body, then I'm hoping that one of the neighbors will step in. Certainly, both China and South Korea have the easily have the capacity to do this kind of testing, and you don't have to violate, the territorial waters of Japan to do the testing. You can be off in the Pacific. We know exactly which way the water goes. I showed the diagram of the currents, so you could be sitting offshore outside of territorial waters of Japan and test the water there. That would, both the Chinese, in fact, fish in that area. So, so there is really no reason why they couldn't do that. And if they do that, I would say it would be great if they also publicize their results. They should do that.
That's great. Before the program, just as we were starting, we did get a message in Japanese that the staff here translated for me saying, please come to Fukushima and investigate. I won't run away or hide. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about, how open the Japanese authorities, responsible for this wastewater and the filtration and treatment and analysis and testing, how open they would be to having more independent parties. And this was leading to a question that I had, which is, does Japan have many watchdog groups that are outside of the sort of the government and industry in general, to your knowledge, to be able to assess this situation?
The Japanese country has a very active anti-nuclear movement. There are a number of citizen groups that are very closely watching this. I think, in fact, the presence of those groups are part of what assures me. If you ask me personally, do I trust what's going on? What I trust, the reason I actually have some trust in the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Agency is precisely because of these anti-nuclear groups that are paying very, very close attention to what's going on, and are definitely not shy about, mentioning any concerns that they have in the public media. So you have to give the Japanese people a lot of credit for, calling to account the people that are supposed to be doing things properly, and that's in part why I don't really have concerns. However, and now, let's step back for a moment. As I said, there are these historical animosities, and those animosities do lead to some folks, being very skeptical, even of the Japanese anti-nuclear groups. There are all sorts of levels of distrust here. And my sense is that the Japanese are quite open to anything that their neighbors might suggest, as long as it's in line with, for example, what the International Atomic Energy Agency does. I would not be surprised if, for example, if the South Koreans petitioned to do their own monitoring within the 10-kilometer zone. I am willing to bet that the Japanese would agree to that. I would think they're open to it.
We kind of one more thread of questioning around the testing, and if a country actually or another independent body monitors the filtered system and then detects and reports a failure in the system, how quickly is Japan able to stop the release of the water? Is that something that can happen fairly immediately, or can you comment on that?
Yes. That can happen immediately. So let me change your question slightly, okay?
Okay.
Which is, how frequently is the testing done? Because you can't stop any faster than the frequency of the testing. So in some sense, what really should be going on is constant testing. That is, you want to be looking at what comes out of the filtration system all the time, not just some of the time. And if you do that, then I think they're in pretty good shape. But keep in mind that if you're testing the output of the filtration system, which is what I'm really worried about, it's a filtration system. That's the problem. that water isn't going directly into the Pacific. It's going into holding tanks. So you have that buffering time because that water is going into tanks and only later will be discharged into the ocean. So as long as they're monitoring the holding tanks, I think it's okay. But they have to be monitoring it all the time.
If another country or a watchdog or another agency detected something, in the water and wanted to report it, would they go to the IAEA to report, or what's the best way to escalate?
Yes. Actually, the best way of doing it is to be public about it.
Right.
Because as soon as you're public about it, you cannot believe how quickly people will react. Okay. So yeah, I would say just going public and then going to the IAEA and I think the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Agency.
Let's turn to food and health risks. That's been such a huge topic here over the last several weeks, with bans of Japanese seafood, coming into where we live here in Hong Kong and other places around Asia. The question is, and this actually comes from somebody in the U.S. who's concerned about the water moving to the Pacific Northwest or Northern California.
Right.
They're asking whether it's safe to eat Japanese seafood, or will it be once that seafood gets to the west coast of the U.S.?
Right. I think the answer is it is safe. There is to date there is no evidence that any of the really problematic radioisotopes have entered into the Pacific at any levels, at measurable levels. Basically, they're below measurable levels at the present time. So I think I don't think there's a safety issue. The key thing to understand is that the Japanese fishing fleets would be very well advised not to fish off the waters of Fukushima Daiichi, and I think they kind of get that point, So I think from the point of view of the Japanese fishing industry, my advice would be advertise where you fished. If you fished away from where the current is flowing, there actually is no issue at all.
One person asked whether there's any precaution that people should be taking if they're in different age groups and maybe have, different health issues depending on the age group that they're in, if they're consuming fish that may have been tainted.
I'm not a health physicist. I'm just a plain physicist, okay? And I'm not a biologist. But if you ask my personal opinion as a physicist, the answer is I think the folks, if somebody's nervous about this, despite all that I've said, then the younger you are, the more worried you should be. An oldster like me, I would have no concerns whatsoever. If you have children eating this, if you're really nervous, then I would err on the side of caution. But as I said before, I don't think there's an issue right now. The time to worry is if you have evidence that the monitors, the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Agency and the IAEA are not doing their job. That's the time to worry. And this is why I think having a third party, one of the neighbors, also doing the monitoring would be a really good idea.
You mentioned in your talk that tritium, if you do ingest it, it would stay in your body for 12 days. Is that right?
Of the order of 10 days, yeah.
10 to 12 days. And that I think when we were talking prior to this program in our preparatory meeting, you also mentioned that if you were concerned about eating seafood that might have tritium in it, that you could drink more water and that it would flush out of your system more quickly.
Yes, more quickly, right.
Yeah. So I think that's it was something
the 10 days refers to somebody having a normal diet the normal ingestion of water. Yeah, you can speed things. The thing to keep in mind is that, most of the water that we ingest, we also eliminate through processes that all of us are very familiar with. And so the more you drink, the more you will go to the bathroom. And so if you're really worried about it, just drink a lot of water.
Which out of the carbon-14, I think you mentioned in your presentation, is it strontium? Did I get that right? Cesium? Which of these or any others are you more concerned about if that filtration system breaks down in terms of
so by far
human
the
health?
most radioactive elements are cesium and strontium. They're not removed by ALPS. There's a separate process by which they're removed, and those are really dangerous. And if ingested, you will definitely have a problem. The one that is traditionally of concern with nuclear power plants, because if there is a release to the atmosphere, which happened, for example, in the case of what happened in Ukraine when the Soviets were still in charge, is the iodine. Is the iodine, any iodine that you ingest will definitely be absorbed by you. And it's known to cause cancer. In fact, there were cancer deaths in Europe as a result of absorbing the iodine that was released in the Ukraine. So there's no fooling around with those radioisotopes. They have to be removed. Very important.
We're getting a lot of questions in here, Professor, and I'm trying to be intelligent about how I present them here. One question is, if I go to a Japanese seafood restaurant and I'm concerned, is there some, device or test or something that I can take and apply it to the seafood to make sure that I'm eating safe seafood?
I'm afraid the answer is no, other than asking where was the fish that you're eating fished? No, the answer is no. So I would say that, from the point of view of calming people, the Japanese fishing industry and food industry would be well advised to advertise where the fish are caught, or whatever you're fishing for, is fish or mollusks. Where are they from?
I think you mentioned that earlier, and I think that's a great suggestion, in addition to what one of the other audience members says here about, and it's posed as a question, why wouldn't, Japanese authorities allow third parties to come in and do testing? Do you think that they'd be open to that, or there'd be some resistance to that from your experience?
No, I don't think so. If it's done in a reasonable way, and, if you come in a hostile manner, nobody's going to appreciate that. But I think, as part, for example, as part of the building a better relationship between the Republic of Korea, ROK, and Japan, I could well imagine that the Japanese would welcome a proper sampling system that the South Koreans might install. Yeah, I could imagine that. That would be actually very sensible. And I think it seems to me actually that the folks in Japan who are distinctly anti-nuclear might in fact welcome that.
Okay, number of other questions. I know we did get a long email from someone prior to the program, and I think we should just address this without going into too much depth on legal issues. But in 1972, Japan signed on to the London Convention. In 1996, they signed on to the protocol that prohibits marine dumping of radioactive waste. Right. And so the person that was asking the question was just wondering, if they've signed on to these anti-dumping protocols and conventions, will this create a huge legal battle for the authorities at Fukushima?
Right. So the thing to understand is that the folks that are charged with basically enforcing those treaties is in fact the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. So they basically define what it means to be dumping radioactive materials, and their standard has to do with safety standard. That is the stuff that is being put into the water, into the oceans, in fact safe for humans? And what I've described so far early during my talk is the IAEA has basically said that what's being put into the water by the Japanese at Fukushima Daiichi is in fact safe in that regard. So from this perspective, the Japanese are not violating the treaties that you're referring to. So the regulatory agency, the agent that determines whether or not the treaties are being violated, is in fact the IAEA. And they have basically said that there is no violation.
I'm curious, what we've learned from Chernobyl, and maybe that ties into a discussion about other options for disposal other than dumping waste into the oceans. Can we talk a little bit about learnings and potential other options for disposing of the waste?
Yeah, so there really is only one other option. And that is to hold the water in the tanks until the tritium has decayed. So the half-life of tritium is a bit over 12 years. So what that means is that if you want a substantial reduction in tritium levels in that water, you probably have to wait something like 3 to 4 half-lives. In other words, something of the order of up to 50 years. So that can be done. I think you saw the picture of the waste tanks and my title slide, and they were going to have to in that case, they would have to keep enlarging that site for something of the order of half a century. And the obvious question, is that sensible? So I think the answer is, as long as the filtration processes, the separation processes, the dilution processes are functioning correctly, that route of basically just storing the contaminated water until the tritium has decayed that's not a very sensible thing to do. The sensible thing to do is to, in fact, filtrate and then dilute and put in the oceans. I think it's certainly true that if, for example, there's a demonstrated failure of the filtration system, it could be that the Japanese ultimately will be forced to do the storage scheme that I just described. But that remains to be seen. We'll see. There is no other way of dealing with the tritium. You store it and wait until it's gone, decays, or you do what the Japanese are doing right now.
Mm-hmm. One person attending tonight asked a really good question about what lessons can be learned from Fukushima, and especially countries that are running nuclear power plants around the world. And the question that runs through my mind off the back of that one is this setting a bad precedent? So lessons we can learn from Fukushima, and is this setting a bad precedent?
Right. I think that is a great question. And this is a question that has concerned me personally ever since I got into the business of dealing with nuclear power. The fundamental lesson to be learned from Fukushima Daiichi is actually act on lessons learned. In the United States, the idea that you need to have a regulatory body that monitors what nuclear power companies are doing, that is independent. It's independent of the promoters of nuclear power. That lesson was only learned after the United States had its own nuclear emergency at 3 Mile Island. Before then, the U.S. nuclear regulatory system was not independent, and it was realized it had to be independent. That accident happened a long time ago, and it's interesting that the Japanese did not act in the way that the Americans did at that point. They kept the regulatory system part of the Japanese Atomic Energy Agency, which is in fact a promoter of nuclear power. And so the regulatory body was not independent. The NRA, the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Agency, was created precisely because the Japanese regulator was not independent. They realized that the reason fundamentally that TEPCO didn't behave itself, that they didn't really deal well with the reactors that were in place at Fukushima Daiichi, they didn't respond to the many complaints about safety practices at that site. The original regulator complained, and the company did nothing. And so the Japanese finally realized, I think we need an independent regulator that can force the company to behave. And the way the regulator can force the company to behave is the regulator has the power to shut the plants down. So my view is that in any country that does not have an independent regulator, where the regulator does not have the power to shut the reactors down when there are infractions of safety, that country is not dealing with its nuclear power system in a sensible way. It's extremely important to have an independent regulator that has real power. And I think that's the fundamental lesson to be learned here. You have to have an independent oversight.
Does the IAEA have authority over countries in that regard?
No, so that's an excellent question. Unfortunately, on the international level, the IAEA does not really have enforcement powers. What it can do, and has done when there are infractions, is to go to the United Nations, and the United Nations can then act. It's the United Nations that has, in some sense, some semblance of enforcement powers. And if you're wondering about, can I point to an example? The obvious example is, of course, is Iran. And UN has, in fact, sanctioned Iran because it has done things in the nuclear power realm, in particular the enrichment of uranium, that violated and hiding the fact that they were doing it, that violated international norms. So unfortunately, the international system does not have the power to shut things down. The Iranians are continuing to enrich, and the international system is not able to stop them from doing it. So this international system has a weakness in this regard.
Going back to the health risks, we did have a question earlier. I just wanted to make sure I address this because there's been a lot of concern about cosmetics that use seafood products and whether they're safe for continued use. Is that something you could share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So here it's useful to know something about tritium. So tritium decays by something called beta decay. What that means is that the tritium, this hydrogen isotope, emits an electron, and when it does so, the hydrogen transmutes into helium, which is a perfectly stable, harmless nucleus atom. Now, what about that electron? It turns out that you can ask, how far does that electron travel? In air, it travels on the average about 6 millimeters. It's about that far, and then it's gone. In water, it travels a tiny fraction of a millimeter, 0.006 millimeters. In other words, it's almost immediately absorbed. It means that, for example, that electron cannot penetrate through your skin. So if you apply a cosmetic that contains tritium, it doesn't go anywhere. It will not hurt the insides of your body. Many people have watches. This used to be very common. It's less common nowadays. Have watches that have dials that glow in the dark. You might wonder, how is that done? Well, what's done is to paint the hands of the watch, as well as the numerals, with material that contains tritium and a fluorescent dye. And so the reason that the hands and numerals glow in the dark is because these electrons are hitting the fluorescent material, and that's why you see it. Is that a concern, a safety concern? No, it isn't, because those electrons cannot get through the body of the watch, nor the glass cover on top of the watch face. So luckily enough, if you have something that has tritium in it, cosmetic, and you apply it, it's not an issue. Now, on top of it, the amount of dilution that happens when you go from some fish or whatever is used as the input to the cosmetic manufacturing process to finally when you get the cosmetic, that dilution process is just enormous. So the odds of you actually ever encountering even one tritium atom in your cosmetic, should there be tritium in the initial animal, is just, the odds are very, very small. So I don't think that's a concern at all. I really don't. Yeah, I would worry a lot if you released those 64 other elements into the water. Okay, that would worry me. Okay, because they don't have this nice property of a decay that releases an electron that hardly does anything. They are dangerous.
That's a good last point that you made. We had one question. Somebody was asking if this is more of a PR issue or if it's really, a scientific hazard issue. And I think I'll let you answer the question, but it seems if we're just talking about tritium, you can answer the question one way. But if you're talking about all of those others, so I'll let you take the question.
You gave the answer. The tritium is really not an issue, and it is, to me, it's stunning that there's been all this angst about tritium, whereas the real worry is about the other stuff and the safety and the efficacy of the filtration process. Worrying about the filtration process is not a PR issue. It's a real safety issue. And it's something to be constantly monitored. The tritium itself is, it's not an issue. I think it's been pointed out in the public domain for a number of years already that all nuclear power plants that cool their core with water, with seawater, all of them put tritium into the sea at levels that are not worrisome, at levels that are actually comparable to what the waste stream from Fukushima Daiichi would be putting in the ocean. So in some sense, as long as the filtration process works, what the Japanese are doing, putting in the water, is not different really from what happens at other power plants that are functioning, that are not damaged. The key question is, does the filtration process work? And are these other isotopes, in fact, removed from the waste stream? And if they are, then there's no issue. If they're not, then there is an issue.
We had another good question from an anonymous attendee of the program, kind of making the comment about, we understand that certain authorities and governments, can manipulate data as well. So if we open up the monitoring to outside authorities, can we trust the IAEA to kind of sift through all the data and make sure that the data hasn't been manipulated to make Japan look bad?
No, absolutely. So the IAEA, the thing that is particularly useful in this particular regard about the IAEA is that all of the states that have nuclear power and nuclear expertise are in fact members of the IAEA. And for example, the report that the IAEA issued on Fukushima Daiichi, the filtration system, in fact, had contributors to this report that came, for example, from China and from South Korea. So, so the folks that are all the neighbors that are concerned about what the Japanese are doing are in fact part of the monitoring system. They play a role, and I would think that they would raise quite a fuss if the IAEA were to learn that the things were being manipulated. So that's that question is an excellent question, and my view is that the IAEA, I think, can deal with results that are being falsified, precisely because all the parties to what's going on here, Japan as well as the neighbors that are concerned, all of them play a significant role in the IAEA monitoring process. They're all there.
Now, thankfully, you've helped explain that filtration happens, and then the wastewater goes into storage tanks before it's actually released into the ocean. So, there is a process that takes place like that. This is worst case scenario. Somebody has asked the question, if that all breaks down and the filtration breaks down, it goes into the tanks, and they flush, carbon-14 and all of these other elements into the ocean. What's the impact on marine life if something like that were to happen? That would be, catastrophic.
Well, that obviously depends on the amount of material that's put in the ocean. Presumably, if something like that happens, it would be some fraction of one of the tanks, one of the holding tanks. So it wouldn't be great, that's for sure. I think that the dilution power of the Pacific would help a great deal in preventing really, let me put it this way: if you think about where the stuff is going, it's going to go into the Pacific eastward, and I would think that as long as the amount that's released that's heavily contaminated is limited to just some fraction of a tank, that there certainly would be sea life that would be heavily contaminated, and probably in the northern eastern Pacific, you'd be well advised to be careful about fishing. Okay, not true for the entire Pacific, but certainly for that. There is an issue here. Would it contaminate the entire ocean? No. The amount that's in the tank is tiny compared to the amount of water in the Pacific. I mean, the dilution power of the Pacific is just enormous. So in terms of long-term effects, I don't think there really would be any. But I think the impact on Japan's reputation, on Japan's nuclear industry, would be just devastating, I would think. And so I think from a practical point of view, I think the chances of that happening are luckily very small, because I think the Japanese are very aware of how devastating that would be. It would be really pretty devastating.
I'm glad you said that at that last point, which is kind of likelihood of something like that happening would be very, very low.
Very, very low. Yeah. I mean, this is the point of something that you've already just emphasized, which is that the filtered water is not directly put into the Pacific. It's first put into holding tanks, and there's a whole series of tanks. So you actually have a lot of buffer time. If there is a failure, then the way that really contaminated water would get into the Pacific, there would have to be a series of failures, because the whole bunch of tanks, and the tanks that are being emptied in the Pacific are tanks that were loaded with the filtered water a while ago, right? So as the constant monitoring is going on, it would be remarkable if the monitoring system of the tanks missed the fact that the filtration system failed to function. That would be hard to believe if it's possible. But, my view is the only way that would happen is if there's, in a sense, deliberate sabotage, which you can, unfortunately, with insider threats and things like that, you can never really totally 100% guarantee will not happen. But it would really have to be sabotage for something like that to happen.
Well, we're running past our time. There have been so many great questions. I'd like to send these questions to you after the program, but maybe we can summarize at least, my takeaway, and I'm sure I missed some points from this presentation, is that, it's important that the filtration system and the water itself are being monitored, and that Japan has, as much transparency as possible for the international community, especially with its neighbors. And in fact, go so far as to hopefully invite outside monitoring authorities from, international bodies, especially its neighbors. And then, basically, this is less about Fukushima, but this idea that there are independent bodies that have the authority in nuclear power states that have the ability to shut down, reactors when there are issues. Are there any other points that you would like to make and summarize and conclude, or things you feel like we missed to help educate the audience tonight?
No, I think you've done an excellent job of summarizing how I view the situation. I think the key elements here are always monitor, and always make sure that you have independence in the monitoring system. Those are the two elements that are absolutely crucial. And that independence means not only that the monitoring is independent, but also that the ability to publicize issues, should they occur, that also must be independent and must be free and open. So those are the takeaways here. And the final takeaway, of course, is I think the question that was asked at the very beginning, which is, at the present time, do we have a reason to worry? And the answer is, at the present time, the answer is no. But you always need to keep your eyes open. You always need to continue monitoring. And I think that's where we are.
Well, Professor Rosner, thank you so much for lending your expertise to this important topic tonight. It's really been a pleasure having you and actually getting to know you and talk to you about this topic. since, our team lives here in the region, and it's something that's of vital concern to all of us. I also hope that this is not going away anytime soon, and I hope that, if we continue to have concerns here in the region, that we'd certainly welcome you to come back and address more of the audience questions.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. My pleasure.
Okay, thank you so much. And I hope the audience tonight really took away a better understanding of the Fukushima wastewater controversy and nuclear waste more broadly. I certainly did. As always, we have a brief poll on tonight's program for the audience on Zoom, which I think you'll find of interest. So I hope you take the opportunity to fill out the poll. And if you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube, you can leave your answers to the poll questions in the comments below, as always. Please stay tuned for more programs upcoming this fall. And thanks a lot for joining us, especially on a Monday night. Thank you so much.